All right, let's talk some Georgia, Florida coming up this Saturday, 3:30 on CBS. Georgia Bulldogs, Florida Gators. Rivalry game, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. Would they try to rename this one to? You remember a few years ago when they tried to rename all the rivalry games to like politically correct stuff? It was what was it they tried to call this? The River Showdown, something River Showdown or whatever. Well, anyway, it's the cocktail party. We all know the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. Georgia and Florida, they play this game every year. Neutral site, Jacksonville, Florida, and this year's edition comes up on Saturday. Georgia, of course, undefeated, currently ranked number 1, 7-0, right? 7-0. Florida at 5-2. Losses to open up the year on the road at Utah, and a few weeks later on the road at Kentucky. Best win for Florida, probably that home win against Tennessee. They had a win last week on the road against South Carolina, which is a big win. It's been a while since Florida had won a road game. Billy Napier, head coach for Florida, I think only had one road win up until that point. Florida was down 10 points in the fourth quarter. They come back. They win the game by 2 on the road in Columbia. So it might not be an impressive win considering the score and the opponent, but given the struggles that Florida had on the road over the last couple of years, it was a pretty good win for the Gators and went into their bye week then with a little bit of momentum coming off of that win. Georgia's going to be coming off their bye week as well. Both teams typically have their bye week before this game is played. Georgia's about a 14.5-point favorite, depending on where you look. You can find it at 15, 15.5, 14, but it's between the 14 and 15.5 mark, depending on where you look. So Georgia just over a 2-touchdown favorite here. I think that kind of makes sense. Florida has been a decent team this year. I think they're probably a game better than what most people thought they would be. Now they're coming up on the tough part of their schedule, as is Georgia, coming off of the bye week for both of these two teams. Florida, of course, after the Georgia game, still has games upcoming with LSU, Missouri, and Florida State, who are all, I believe, ranked in the top 15, right? LSU, Florida State, Missouri, all ranked in the top 15. They also have a game with Arkansas where they should be favored. That's probably the only game left on Florida's schedule where they'll be a favorite, will be that Arkansas game. Tough schedule down the stretch here for Florida. Georgia's schedule last month or so of the season looks more difficult now than it did at the beginning of the season. Georgia will still be favored in all of those games, but Georgia has Florida this week. They've got a top 15 Ole Miss team coming up in Athens, a top 15 Missouri team coming up in Athens. They play Tennessee on the road, and then they finish up with Georgia Tech. It's just an absolute disaster. So I think this is an important game here for both teams coming off of a bye week with their most difficult stretch of games ahead of them. Both teams really feel like they need a win here to sort of propel themselves into the last month of the season. The winner of this game will be in first place in the SEC East. If Georgia wins, of course, they'll be in first by themselves as the only undefeated team. If Florida wins, they'll still have the one loss to Kentucky. Georgia also will have one loss to Florida, but Florida would actually hold the tiebreaker in that scenario, but having beat Georgia. So it's a huge game, everything technically on the line here for both teams, with the exception of maybe the college football playoff for Florida. That's probably out of reach already with the 2 losses. But everything in the SEC is still up for grabs in this one. I do think this is going to be a more competitive game in terms of a final score than the last couple of games that we've seen that kind of got away from Florida. Florida did come back a little bit in the second half last year. Now, at the start of the third quarter, I think they scored 2 or 3 touchdowns to kind of tighten it up, but then Georgia pulled away at the end. I think this will be a pretty good game. I don't expect Georgia to come out and just blow Florida away. Georgia, of course, missing All-American tight end Brock Bowers. But look, I'm going to say the same thing I always say about injuries. This is football. Players get injured. We hate it. No one likes to see anybody get injured, whether it's a backup player or a star player. We never like to see anybody get injured, but the reality is this is football. Players get injured, and you just have to prepare and develop additional players in the extent that someone does get injured. And for Georgia and Brock Bowers, that's going to be the case. Florida's got injuries of their own they're dealing with here 7 and 8 weeks into the season. So nobody feels sorry for Georgia because they've got an injury, right? And Georgia's got some additional injuries on top of the Brock Bowers situation. They've had some injuries at running back, offensive line, different things like that. But the reality is everybody suffers with injuries over the course of a season. So, next man up sounds kind of cliche. And look, there's nobody on Georgia's roster that can replace Brock Bowers. I'm not going to pretend that Georgia's a better team without Brock Bowers than they are with him. But Georgia's got a ton of experienced playmakers, talented playmakers on the outside and at tight end that can step up and combined, I think, can try to help fill in the gap left by Brock Bowers. We'll see. Florida this year, Graham Mertz, look, he's played better than most of us thought he would play. Let's give the guy a little bit of credit, okay? Today's Thursday. This is kind of my straight-laced sort of thoughts about the game. Tomorrow will be the trash-talking video like I do every Friday. And, we'll say some things about Graham Mertz then, I'm sure. But the reality is Graham Mertz has played better than most anybody thought he would play this season at Florida. He's completing a very high percentage of his passes. Now, it's a lot of dink and dunk stuff for Florida. And Graham Mertz does spend a lot of time running for his life. He gets pressured more times than not when he drops back to pass. But, again, that's a kind of a tip of the cap to Graham Mertz there, that even though he is under this kind of pressure, he is still able to dump the ball off and complete these passes. The running game for Florida, to me, has not been quite as good as what it was last year. Now, they still have the same running backs, basically, in Montrell Johnson and ETN. It's the offensive line for Florida, I think, that has taken a step back this year. We talked about it's kind of their inability to protect Graham Mertz, and I think some of that has shown in the running game as well. Doesn't mean Florida's running backs aren't any good. They were good last year. They're good again this year. They're the same two running backs. I just think that running game's been hampered a little bit because of the offensive line. And last year with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, that gave you like an additional threat in terms of running the ball. And while Graham Mertz can scramble around a little, everyone would agree when it comes to running the ball, he's no Anthony Richardson, right? So I think those two things combined, going from Anthony Richardson to Graham Mertz and sort of a decline in the offensive line, has led to Florida not being as good of a rushing team in 2023 as we saw in 2022. Now, they've made that up with an improved defense. Their defense is clearly better this year than it was last year, whether you're talking about stats and numbers or whether you're talking about just watching Florida play and being able to tell that they're much more aggressive. They seem more disciplined. I think a lot of that can be credited to Austin Armstrong, who they brought in on the defensive side of the ball, a defensive coach to help out on that side of the ball, and I think that has paid immediate dividends. Now, they do struggle to get to the quarterback. They don't have a ton of sacks, and Georgia doesn't give up a ton of sacks. So while I do expect Graham Mertz to be under constant pressure in this game, not because Georgia is great at sacking the quarterback. They're not. Georgia's not great at getting the quarterback down on the ground either. But Georgia is great at causing pressure, and Florida is not very good at all at protecting Graham Mertz. I think that's a bad combination for Florida. On the opposite side, Florida doesn't sack the quarterback at a high rate. They don't pressure the quarterback at a high rate. And Georgia doesn't give up hardly any sacks at all. So I don't think Florida is going to be – I don't expect Carson Beck to be running for his life for the entire game. I think that's going to be more so something we see from Graham Mertz. Let's talk about we talked about Florida's running game. Let's talk about Georgia's running game a little bit. Georgia's running game is taking a step back this year. Now, I think there's a couple of different reasons for that. Number one, even if every Georgia running back on the roster, every single running back on the Georgia roster, even if they were all 100% healthy, the overall talent level at the running back position at Georgia is just not what it has been over the last 10 to 15 years. You really have to go back pre-Todd Gurley to find a Georgia running back room, in my opinion, like this one. That they've been more talented in the running back room every single year for about the last 10 years. You add the injury situation on top of that, which has hampered several Georgia running backs over the course of the season. It hasn't been a great situation for Georgia running backs. Daijun Edwards has been kind of the constant there. He seems to always stay healthy. And while he's a really good running back, there's nothing really elite about Daijun Edwards. And I mean, I hate to put him down because he has been such a sort of good overall player for Georgia for what seems like 3 or 4 years now. He just doesn't have the high-end potential that Georgia's feature running backs have had in the past. He doesn't have the breakaway speed. He doesn't have the same type of power and shiftiness. He's got a good combination of those things. He's just, if you just kind of think to yourself, who was Georgia's best running back each year over the last 10 years, and you just start, Todd Gurley, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh. Daijun Edwards he's just not any of that. right? Again, it's not that he's bad. So you got him. He's typically like an RB3 or 4, but he's really been Georgia's primary running back this season because of injuries. You got Branson Robinson, who is close to being able to come back. Kendall Milton is always hit or miss at running back for Georgia. He seems to stay injured all the time. So it's going to be kind of a rotating cast of characters at the running back position for Georgia in this game, like it has been for the majority of the season. But I do expect Georgia to come out and try to run the ball in this game, if for no other reason. We saw the success that Kentucky had against Florida doing that. And while Georgia's offensive line has struggled at times this year when it comes to running the ball, in fact, they've been a little disappointing to me in terms of their run blocking. I feel like this is a week where Georgia is going to make a concerted effort to run the ball, kind of assert their will on that Florida defensive front. Having seen what Kentucky was able to do with Ray Davis. Now, Georgia does not have a Ray Davis on the roster. They don't. Some Georgia fans, some blind homers will tell you they do. They don't. There's just not a running back of that caliber there. But the combination of running backs at UGA, the offensive line, and what I perceive to be as a sort of inferior Florida defensive front, at least against the run, I think those things combined are going to lead Georgia's offense and Mike Bobo to at least attempt to come out and try to just run the ball and make Florida stop it. I mean, if Georgia's able to Kentucky averaged, 9 yards a carry against Florida? If Georgia gets half of that, they'll win the game. Now, you can say the same thing about Florida. I mean, this is true in a lot of football games, right? Whoever runs the ball better tends to win the game. If Florida averages 4 or 5 yards a carry in this game, they're probably going to win. If Georgia averages 4 or 5 yards a carry in this game, they're probably going to win. Carson Beck, I'm kind of hoping will have a great game. He's from the Jacksonville area, so this kind of a homecoming for Carson Beck. And, he waited his turn. He kind of did what a lot of players and quarterbacks in particular just don't want to do anymore, which is kind of just wait. Kind of hard to believe, but this is Carson Beck's 4th year in college. He enrolled during the COVID year, 2020. Kind of, 4th string there, backups in 21 and 22, and now he's kind of getting his opportunity here in 2023 to start, and he gets to go back to his hometown this weekend of Jacksonville, where he won a state title in high school, and kind of play in front of his friends and family and stuff like that. So I'm hoping he'll have a good game, and he's played really well this year, about 14 or 15 touchdown passes, 2 or 3 interceptions, completing about 75% of his passes. He's 4th in the country in passing yards. Really, really good year so far for Carson Beck. This will be a test for him, a rivalry game. Emotions will be high. He's from there. Like I said, he's probably putting a lot of pressure on himself to play well in this game. And you have the question mark about, what's he going to do without Brock Bowers? We don't really know. He's never played a game without Brock Bowers before, right? Brock Bowers has been kind of a security blanket for Carson Beck at times in certain games this season, and that security blanket is not going to be there on Saturday. So, like I mentioned, there's no one player that's going to, kind of step up and give you what Brock Bowers gave you. If you're Georgia, you're going to have to do this from multiple kind of angles, right? Ladd McConkey, who has battled a back injury for most of this year. Hopefully, another week of rest for him has got him closer to 100%. He's a player that potentially could have a breakout game against Florida this week. The 2 transfers that Georgia brought in, Ra Thomas on the outside from Mississippi State, Dominic Lovett, who's sort of a slot-type receiver on the inside, Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint. Would love to have a big game here. Some of you Florida fans might remember it was 2 or 3 years ago when Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint had that just gruesome leg injury. Seems like it was down near the goal line on a deep pass inside the 10-yard line, and basically snapped his leg in two. Some of y'all, even if you don't know the name, the Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint, most Florida fans I think will probably remember that injury. Anyway, he's back 100% healthy, and he's had a couple of really good games this year. And I kind of relate him at wide receiver to Dejon Edwards at running back, right? Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint's never going to be an all-pro NFL wide receiver. He's not the tallest guy. He's not the fastest guy. But he runs he runs really good routes. He's got really good hands. He always knows what to do and when to do it. He blocks well on the perimeter, which is a big deal at Georgia. And if it's 3rd and 6, it seems like he's always catching a 7-yard pass. If it's 3rd and 6, he's catching a 7-yard pass. If it's 3rd and 4, he's catching a 5-yard pass. That kind of thing, kind of a possession-type receiver. And he's having his best year so far. So, and then at the tight end position, it's going to be Oscar Delp, a 2nd-year guy, and a couple of freshmen in Lawson Lucky and Pierce Sperlin that are going to kind of have to combine as 2 or 3 different players to try to give them close to what you would get from a Brock Bowers, right? Georgia will probably run less two tight end sets in this game than they typically run. With Brock Bowers, you can kind of split him out as a wide receiver. You can play him in the slot. They've lined Brock Bowers up in the backfield as sort of a second halfback on a lot of plays. And then when you do that, you have the ability to also play Oscar Delp as sort of an inline tight end. Not that we won't run any two tight end sets. I'm sure there will be situations where you see Oscar Delp and maybe Lawson Lucky or Pierce Sperling out there at the same time. But given the injury to Brock Bowers and sort of the abundance of talent Georgia has at the wide receiver position, I think you're going to see less two tight end sets and more like 3 and 4 wide sets. And when I say abundance of talent, I'm not pretending that Georgia has a roster full of NFL Hall of Fame wide receivers. They don't. Georgia doesn't have an Ohio State wide receiving room or Texas or anything like that. But for Georgia standards, this wide receiver room is pretty good. If you're a Florida fan and you pay any attention at all to Georgia, then you probably know the struggles Georgia has had with recruiting elite level, like 5-star type wide receivers. I mean, outside of George Pickens, I can't really name a 5-star wide receiver that's come to Georgia in the last several years. Georgia only has ever had one wide receiver eclipse the 1,000-yard mark. So I'm not out here pretending Georgia's wide receivers are a bunch of future All-Americans or anything like that. But as a group, Georgia's wide receiver core is pretty good. Ladd McConkey has proven to be a problem for a lot of teams going back a couple of years now. Already talked about Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint, the 2 transfers that we brought in. As a group, Georgia's wide receiver core is pretty good. So when people ask the question, who's going to replace Brock Bowers? Well, the answer is not any one person. Ladd McConkey is going to have 2 or 3 more catches than he normally would have. Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint is going to have 2 or 3 more catches than he would normally have. One of the tight ends is going to have to sort of come to the forefront, right? Maybe a Ra Thomas or a Dominic Lovett has their breakout game, right? It's going to have to be a combination of things in terms of replacing Brock Bowers. There's no player in the country that just comes in and replaces Brock Bowers. I mean, he's one of the best players in the country. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Not having Brock Bowers is a problem, and that's there's nothing else really you can say about that. As far as this particular game goes, though, I can't imagine Florida having very much success running the ball on Georgia, particularly between the tackles. Now, they may be able to get outside some with Etienne and Montrell Johnson. I'm not too concerned about Graham Mertz being able to take off and run. If you watched the Georgia-Auburn game, you saw a couple of quarterbacks in that game really take advantage of Georgia's defense on the ground. As well as Mertz has played this year, I still don't see him as the type of quarterback that's really going to do that. So you're really relying on the running backs there if you're Florida. And I think for the most part, Georgia will be able to handle the running game of Florida. So it's going to come down, I think, to Graham Mertz's ability to pass the ball against the Georgia defense, Florida's offensive line's ability to protect Graham Mertz, to give him time to be able to throw the ball downfield on the Georgia defense. And Georgia offensively, I think they're going to run the ball. I think that's going to be the plan here, is to run the ball. I think that's probably a smart plan. I think that really should be anybody's plan against Florida, at least in the beginning. Run the ball until they show you they can stop it. If they can't, then just keep running the damn thing, right? Now, I still think Carson Beck will have his shots in this game. He'll take his downfield throws. Georgia's not going to line up and run the ball 90% of the time. In fact, they've been more of a passing team really so far this season than they have a running team. I do think this will be a close game. I think 14.5-point spread is a little bit too high. Georgia's had a hard time covering spreads in their games this year. In fact, I believe Georgia has only covered the spread once in 2023. And I don't expect them to cover the spread here. I do think Georgia wins the game. I just think right now they're still too talented, I think, to lose this game to Florida top to bottom, right? Florida's working on a really good recruiting class for this coming cycle, a top 5 class. And if they get 2 or 3 of those in a 4-year period, then they will be at a level, I think, where, not only would they be able to compete with Georgia, but you're talking about stacking multiple top 5 recruiting classes in a row. Those are national title type aspirations at that point. So we'll see if they can get there. But right now, I just feel like overall the talent level of Georgia will win out in this game. And I've had a lot of fun at Billy Napier's expense, and I'll have a lot of fun at his expense again tomorrow when I make the hype and hate trash talk video about the Georgia-Florida game. But the reality is, just no one on the planet thinks that Billy Napier is at a Kirby Smart level when it comes to head coaching. I don't care what type of rating or ranking you want to look at or go by. Right now, Billy Napier is just looking way up at Kirby Smart. Now, as a staff, I like what Florida's got. I would still prefer Georgia's staff, but Billy Napier's got a good staff there. I think this will be a close, competitive game into the fourth quarter, and I will not be surprised if it ends up being a one-possession game. As far as a score prediction goes, I'm going to say something in the 10-point range. I think Georgia probably gets to the 30s, but not much more. So you're looking at, Georgia with a score of 31, 33, 34, 35, somewhere in that range. And then, Florida somewhere in maybe the 24 to 27 range, so like a 34 to 24, 37 to 27, 31 to 20, somewhere in that range. One score game in the fourth quarter, maybe Georgia tacks one on late to sort of make it a two-possession game. I do think this will be a really good game. I'm looking forward to it. It's a rivalry game, obviously. And we'll see. I do think Georgia will lose a game this season. I don't think they're going to go undefeated. I did predict them to go 12-0 in the offseason. But the reality is Georgia just hasn't played at a high enough level consistently enough over the course of this season for me to be confident at this point that they're going to be able to get through the last month and a half of the season or so undefeated. They've got this Florida game. I already mentioned Missouri, Ole Miss on the road at Tennessee. Seems like Georgia's probably going to drop a game along the way somewhere. The hard part is trying to figure out, okay, well, which one will it be? I don't think it'll be the Florida one, but I don't think it will be any one in particular, right? It's hard to – it may be the Florida. It could be this one, and then maybe they beat Ole Miss, Missouri, and Tennessee. Maybe they beat Florida but lose on the road at Tennessee. It does seem to me like Georgia is sort of primed to drop a game here. You can't just keep winning forever. Georgia's won 25 in a row at this point. Is that right? 42 out of their last 43. I mean, as a Georgia fan, I'd love to hope that is going to continue and keep up forever, but the reality is it's just not. Georgia's not going to win every game it plays from now to the end of time. They're not going to beat Florida every year from now to the end of the time, or Tennessee or anyone else for that matter. They're going to catch losses at some point. Based on what I've seen from Georgia this year, it does feel like they're probably going to lose a game in the regular season. Could be this one, but I'm going to take the good guys. Give me Georgia, low to mid-30s, Florida, mid-20s. All right, appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.